Hello guys, how's it going? My name is Dalaran. Patch 11.1 is bringing with it a ton of new class changes and plenty of talent revamps, with the class of Mage probably being one of the few classes that's getting the most amount of changes. Some good, some not so much. Especially, it seems like for Season 2, they're adjusting the resource generation of specs like Fire as well as Frost. Not necessarily resource like mana, but things like your Fire Blast procs, your Phoenix Flames, and how actively you could use instacast abilities to chain big Pyroblast's fire, which seems like it's getting a bit of a reduction. But Frost also is receiving similar type of restructuring, but in a much better way, where you actually generate plenty of procs, but those procs will no longer cannibalize and cancel each other out. It is kind of wild to see a class getting this many resource adjustments mid-season of an expansion, but it looks like mages are going to go through a bunch of consequential changes, and quite a lot of updates as well as potentially rotational adjustments are planned for them on the horizon. So for today's video, I did want to take a much closer look at the Mage revamp coming out for the patch 11.1 and all of the changes for Arcane, Frost, and Fire. As always, if you guys want to see more 11.1 updates like these, be sure to follow the channel and subscribe. But otherwise, let's dive right in. First of all, the actual tier set look for mages, I wasn't quite sure if I was going to enjoy it, because I guess Crystals looks alright, but it's kind of grown on me. I actually like it. You know, almost like the face mask almost makes you think of like a Sunland vampiric teeth. Something more sinister than just Veranoth looking thing. I like it a lot, actually. The bonuses themselves for mages, I didn't really find all that compelling. I will go over them very quickly when we talk about every single one of the specs, starting with Arcane. When we get to Arcane, I feel like some of the other class bonuses play a little bit better. They say decent, I just think they're a bit maybe too plain. But starting with some of the more generalized mage changes of the bat abilities like your barrier, as well as, or rather, mass barriers, mana cost has been reduced, which is good for PvP more than anything. Just a slight reduction, because mana is normally not a resource you regularly end up spending and needing for PvE content, but in PvP that can be quite useful. Polymorph also no longer fully heals an enemy. I'm pretty sure I can't polymorph any of these trained dummies. Yeah, cannot polymorph any of them at all. But if, let's say, you polymorph a critter or another player, normally when you polymorph them, they start to rapidly regenerate health. They reduce that regen by 50%. So for PvP, that's also going to be pretty good. For PvE, I don't think that'll make much of a consequential change. Also, when you polymorph an enemy, they don't immediately break as soon as you, I guess that guy breaks there because it's a critter with no health whatsoever. But when you polymorph an enemy, it now functions very similar to some of the other crowd control effects, where they don't immediately break with damage, because now polymorph, like all the other CCs, has a damage threshold. It isn't a big one, but an auto attack or a couple of ticks of a dot will still keep the enemy polymorph for a little bit, which is nice, primarily for PvE content. Like if somebody accidentally auto attacks an enemy that you meant to polymorph, and as soon as they back away, you'll still be able to lock in and keep that polymorph. So that is super nice in that regard specifically. Outside of the general changes though, we got some adjustments to the hero specs, and some of them are going to be more spec specific, but I first want to start off with one that affects both Fire and Frost, which is the Frost Fire playstyle. You'll actually notice that the actual build of Frost Fire changed a little. They have adjusted a lot of these talents to reallocate them a little bit. All your utility talents go to the right hand side, except for Frostfire Infusion, which is a bit of damage. Then you still have the Frostfire Bolt and everything that modifies it. But on the left hand side, we now have Isothermic Core, Excess Fire, and your Excess Frost, because all of those abilities, all those talents now function off of each other a little bit more. They wanted to update Frostfire Mage to have it be less focused on having to track too many auras at once, because there's a lot of buff tracking with Frostfire to make sure you are capitalizing on your excess fire as well as your excess frost and are not wasting them. So they try to adjust it so there's less mandatory tracking by having these talents flow from one into another, as one talent procs the next one, which procs the other one, so it has a bit of a static flow to the playstyle. So Isothermic Core still going to crash Comet Storms with a Meteor or Meteor with a Comet Storm, depending on your spec, but now Isothermic Core is what procs your excess fire. Casting Meteor, at least for fire mages, will now cause your next fire blast to explode into Frostfire Burst, which has gotten buffed up by 70% in damage, so it does quite a bit more additional damage, still has a soft cap of 8 targets. But The Frostfire Burst also still will reduce the other ability for fire mages, that is going to be Phoenix Flames. So excess fire gets procced by Isothermic Core through Meteor or Comet Storm depending on your spec. Your excess frost now gets procced whenever you consume excess fire. So drop a Meteor, excess fire into excess frost. So now there's a bit more of a flow to it specifically, which still empowers your Phoenix Flame or Flurry, but also causes Ice Novas to hit for 200% effectiveness, which is a decent buff as well, but also helps to reduce the cooldown of your Meteor, so you can use Meteor more often to then flow back into Fire and Frost. You still have the interaction with your Flash Freeze Burn, which procs you both excess frost and excess fire. So now there's a bit of a different flow to the spec itself, with a couple of other adjustments they've done for frost as well as fire when it comes to the resource generation. This change to Frostfire, having a specific flow, does help it a little bit, especially if you're not a big fan of having to track all those different weak auras. So I think this is a buff towards Frostfire, but it may adjust your rotation so you are able to maximize all of those buffs a little bit more effectively. However, from there, we can move on to the spec of Arcane Mage. And as I said, I do want to go over really quickly about all the tier sets that all the mages are running with. So the mages tier set primarily is going to be Jackpot. Your abilities have random chance to proc Jackpot. For Arcane Mages, it allows them to grant you clear casting and an 8% increased spell damage for 12 seconds. Casting Touch of the Magi always hits a Jackpot, and whenever you hit a Jackpot, you also gain either attunement at 100% effectiveness. So there's some clear casting damage procs as well as missile focused gameplay for Arcade, which works out. There's a lot of builds that really play with it, but I feel like it's just one of those tier sets that we've seen in the past, just a little bit more control with that Touch of the Magi, which is going to be nice, but clear casting and missile builds are fairly standard for Arcane for the most part. As for Arcane, their talent hasn't changed too much, but the tree has been adjusted a little bit, and there's some significant enough changes here and there that are noticeable. Like, for example, you have your Reverberate on the same row as Amplification, so more missiles or more Arcane Explosions for AoE damage, so a bit more of a focus for one or the other. Couple of the other talents like Dematerialize is in a different spot, Energy Reconstitution is in a different spot, Consortium's Bobble is in a different spot, so all these things got adjusted. They also did this tricky thing where they applied Arcane Tempo, but also made it on the same choice note as Big Brain, so you either can get damage from clear casting or gain haste for consuming arcane charges, which personally not a big fan of. I loved having both of those talents together, but I kind of sort of understand why they adjusted it in the way they did. Though for the most part, your capstones on the bottom row stays about the same, so it's a slight alteration to some of the changes, to some of the talent positions for Arcane Mage specifically. They've also adjusted the talent of Enlightened, which previously used to give you arcane damage, arcane spell damage above a certain number of mana, and below a certain number of mana, like a specific threshold, it would start to grant you mana regen. But now, both of those effects scale depending on your mana. So when you're at full mana, you have full arcane damage, but your mana regen is not nearly as high. But as you start to spam that mana pretty aggressively, I'm just going to start spamming Arcane Blast. You can see that the mana regen is starting to rise, but the damage is starting to drop. So now it has more of this dynamic scaling factor behind it, which is very, very interesting. Or at least I find it kind of interesting. I think this would give the Enlightened a little bit more value, because no longer do you have like an on and off switch for this ability where you either have full max damage or you turn off all that max damage altogether. So I think that's probably going to be good in a long haul, but it is a very interesting change that is going to scale around with the mana. Hopefully they'll make it a little bit more responsive, because it does feel like it has a bit of a delay between its damage components and mana regen. Aside of this, they're really trying to get Arcane Mages to go back to playing Sun Fury. I'm a big fan of Spellslinger. Sun Fury also worked out for it as well, but they are adjusting it in a few different ways. Like, for example, the Meteorites from Glorious Incandescence. Consuming Burden of Power now summons 4 Meteorites, and those Meteorites will now grant you arcane charges for every single one of those Meteorite impacts. So it can grant you more resources, which is pretty good too. Also, Burden of Power, they've actually went back and adjusted it to like the release of War Within version, which allows Burden of Power to now benefit from arcane barrages. So yet another ability that can help you overlap all these different buffs that can help amplify for some massive arcane barrages, which is a pretty fun part of the playstyle of Sun Fury, and I think it fits it better to work of barrages. I guess also Arcane Blast is fine, but barrages just felt a lot more satisfying. From there, we have the spec of Fire Mage, which is my favorite so far, at least of live version, but also I've been playing around with it on PTR. Big fan of Fire in general. Their tier set plays heavily around the jackpot mechanic, which reduces the cooldown of combustion by 3 seconds. Casting combustion always hits a jackpot at 200% effectiveness, and whenever you do get a jackpot hit, your damage is increased by 15% for 7 seconds. If you get a jackpot from a combustion on use effect, the duration of this buff is increased by 100%. So it's basically shorter cooldown on combustion, and when you press combustion, you do 50% more damage. Very standard, very box standard. Mages play around combustion already anyway, so I guess that one makes all the sense in the world. But what they're doing for mages, however, is I think a bit of a crime, because this is their blue post. Fire's resource economy in War Within has been, and I'm just quoting this, too generous is what the blue post says, which made spells like Fireball and Scorch feel unnecessary to use in day-to-day combat. The goal of this build is to reduce access to things like Phoenix Flames and Fire Blast, and increase reliance on casted spells. Now, this is going to be a bit of a hot take, at least for me, but I think Fire Mage, personally, is a lot more fun when it's fueled full of instant casting, especially when you combine it together with Frostfire over on Live Realms. I love that version of Fire Mage back during the beta and the alpha of the War Within. I love it right now, the way that it plays currently. I think it's very, very highly effective, and I think it's just more fun and engaging, at least for me personally. But maybe I'm like one of the few players that enjoys mages when they play like super fast-paced, engaging playstyle. Maybe there's a lot of mages out there that would love to go back to spamming Fireball as your primary ability, as your primary builder, and would rather have a slower flow to the gameplay where you just stand there and just spam fireballs until you go into big pyroblast combustion windows, and so you have like a big ebb and flow. Maybe that's what they're trying to hit. I feel like maybe if they are trying to make Fireball a better ability, I don't think it should be at a detriment of those instant casting abilities and the instant casting playstyle. Like, they could probably have made both playstyles just as valid, just as viable. You can just buff up Fireball without having to nerf all of the other components, in my opinion. But again, like I said, it's a hot take. I definitely have a preference when it comes to the way I like to play Fire Mage. But as far as in terms of what these changes are going to mean is things like Heat Shimmer, for example. This ability apparently is no longer is going to make a Scorch instant cast. It instead increases its damage by 10%. They said that apparently Heat Shimmer contributed to mages having too many resources, so they're trying to starve them out a little bit. At least that's what it looks like by initial blue post. There are buffing abilities like Pyroblast by 10% in terms of damage, but also reducing its mana cost a little bit. Flame Strike also getting buffed up by 25%, but they're also reducing the mana cost of this ability as well a little bit. Controlled Destruction is getting buffed up, as well as Pyrotechnics. Pyrotechnics, they're increasing the crit chance of your fireballs by 20% instead of 10% to make you want to play Fireball or Frost Fireball, because both of them get the benefit from it anyway. The talent of Controlled Destruction also has been updated. It now also triggers from your Fireball, not just your Pyroblast, so I guess you get to stack it up a little bit quicker. With the talent of Master of the Flame, it now also has been updated to increase Ignite as well as Fireball's damage by 15% while combustion is no longer active. With the talent of Call of the Sun King, it also has been updated. It no longer grants you an additional charge of Phoenix Flames, leaving you with only 2 charges, but now it does grant you 50% increased Phoenix damage instead. While you can maintain 3 charges of your Fire Blast, you will see the cooldown of Fire Blast increase to 14 seconds up from 12 seconds, so a very light change there. The talent of Hyperthermia's duration is also being reduced down to 5 seconds from, I think, 6 or 7 seconds that it was initially. And the talent of Phoenix Reborn will now only refund a single Phoenix Flame in terms of the charges on use, but the damage of that amp for that one singular refunded Phoenix is being increased to 200% up from 100%. Outside of this, it looks like they're trying to buff up Sun Fury for Fire Mage. I'm a big fan of Frostfire in particular, but they're trying to make him a little bit more competitive with the Inglorious Incandescence buff, which is going to have a better cooldown reduction for your Fire Blast increase to 2 seconds of cooldown reduction when a meteor strikes the target instead of a single cooldown reduction, to try to get you to wanna, hey, if you want to play more faster pace, procky, instant casty playstyle, you may want to play Sun Fury potentially. So maybe that's how they're trying to synergize it. But overall though, after getting some time to play with Fire Mage over on the beta PTR realms, technically you still can achieve a very similar, consistent, instant cast focus build that you have over on the live realms as you could in 11.1, but it is a little bit harder to pull off, and it's not going to be fully instant cast. You are going to have some moments of downtime where you just have to spam out either Fireball or Frost Firebolt until you get a decent bit of procs, unless you get super lucky with some of those different procs from the Fire Mage playstyle. Heat Shimmer is an ability that I actually ended up utilizing fairly regularly to try to grant you more procs, as those scorches can come in clutch and be helpful. They don't necessarily solve the issue, but getting more procs when you're waiting for your Phoenix Flames, your Frost Firebolt procs, and the Flame Blast, Fire Blast to come back up a little quicker, getting those scorches in between of those does help alleviate some of those issues. Also, the changes to Frostfire Mage does make it so that you may want to change the order of how you use some of your abilities, like your Phoenix Flames, Fire Blast, Frostfire Bolts, scorches with the Heat Shimmer talent. So you may end up having to adjust the order of those abilities depending on the procs to maintain a very similar flow, but you can't just spam out Fire Blast and then roll into Phoenix Flames and then get other procs. It is a little bit more nuanced, so you may have to be a little more careful which abilities you use. But it is possible to get fairly decent chains of just pure single target instant casty goodness though. But this seems to be the build that is performing fairly well, at least from what I've been able to see over on the logs. This kind of ends up dropping the whole lit fuse and ends up playing around that Firebolt for more meteors, for isothermic cores in order to get you more procs of excess frost and fire, in order to get Phoenix Flames a little quicker, playing into more single target heavy with Phoenix Reborn and Shimmer. So this seems to work out fairly well in order to chain more procs, in order to get some of those abilities back up and online. So technically it's possible, but they're definitely trying to shut down the fast-paced nature of Fire Mage, which personally not a big fan of. But it is weird to do this many kind of resource adjustments in the middle of an expansion as we're heading into the next season, which I think is the awkward moment. Maybe if that was something that was maybe done for, let's say, the launch of the War Within, I feel like it would have been maybe understandable, but it seems like they're trying to curtail a very fun, fast-paced playstyle, and I just don't think that is the right way to go about fixing the issues that they feel with Fire Mages. But maybe you guys in the comments may have a better solution for as to what they could do in order to adjust Fire Mage. I really think they should allow you to play a full instacasty build, because I'm a big fan of it. But if they want to make things like Fireball and those slower pace builds a little bit better, I think you can just buff them without nerfing what is currently viable. Outside of that, we also got Frost Mages, which are also seeing a bit of a resource adjustment like Fire, but in a very different direction that's actually very good. Their tier set, however, I don't know, wasn't super impressed with it, but your special abilities have a chance to hit Jackpot, which fires out a Frostbolt volley, dealing instantaneous damage to your primary target, as well as offset damage up to 8 additional targets. Casting Ice Veins always procs this volley. Now, like I said before, they are also doing some resource adjustment for Frost Mages, but I feel like these perform a little bit better than what they've been able to do for the Spec of Fire so far. One of those changes have been to the talent of Freezing Winds. No longer do you get an orb that generates you a bunch of Fingers of Frost procs. Instead, now Frozen Orb will deal additional damage to all units affected by Blizzard, so it gives it a little bit more of this focused AoE component, which does make the ability quite good, especially when you play Spellslinger and you get a bunch of these orbs firing out back to back. Speaking of AoE damage, the ability of Blizzard has also been buffed up by quite a bit. It has a 12-yard range, a 12-second duration, but also 100% additional damage. So playing the full Frost or Blizzard focused build is actually very possible, and to some cases I would say very viable. It deals a significant bit of damage in AoE, and I like the additional range that you have, and the fact that you can apply a bunch of them with Frozen Orb with the instant cast. I feel like that could give the playstyle just overall just a bit more of a punch. Ice Lances also, whenever they are powered by Fingers of Frost, Ice Lances will no longer consume the proc of your Flurry, or rather the Winter's Chill proc that you get with your Flurries. So I'm just going to Frostbolt here for a little bit until I get a couple of Fingers of Frost procs. Now that I got 2 of them, when I flurry, normally when I lance, it would consume Winter's Chill. But it doesn't, because I already have a proc of the Fingers of Frost that empowers your lances to treat the target as if they're frozen, to give you a higher chance to critical strike them. So this is really, really good because you no longer have this proc cannibalization as a Frost Mage whatsoever. This is very, very good. I feel like this has been a problem for Frost Mages for a while because it feels like you're losing on some much needed value from the spec. When you have the Flurry proc with those Winter Chills, but then you also have all of those Lance procs with Fingers of Frost, it just felt really, really bad. It made you think, okay, well, normally you would try to Lance, and then maybe set up some kind of like a Flurry thing or delay flurries up until you can make sure you're not sacrificing those lances in the future. Overall, what I'm trying to say is I'm a huge fan of this change. I'm a big fan, and I always hate it when classes have proc cannibalization going on as part of the rotation. Plenty of classes do that even right now to this day. So I'm very, very glad that we're able to fix that with Frost Mages. And even though adjustment technically don't get as many Fingers of Frost procs, it still feels really, really good because those procs all get super big value. And I don't really notice it too much when it comes to a Frost Mage in particular either way. However, with some buffs come nerfs, and Spellslinger is getting nerfed a little bit. The Frost Splinter damage has been nerfed by 10%. Splinter Storm damage also nerfed by 10%, as well as the embedded Frost Splinter damage nerfed by 10%. So it looks like they're trying to make Spellslinger less of a go-to playstyle, or at least trying to make it a little bit more competitive to what Frostfire can offer. But to me, it does like the Spellslinger Frost Mage is getting nerfed because it's become one of my favorite playstyles altogether. Big fan of the orb type of gameplay, but I guess it makes sense that it would nerf it. It just seems like a really, really good combo. But with that, as always, I do want to thank you guys so much for checking out this Mage update, and I do hope you guys did enjoy this new 11.1 video. If you guys did enjoy it or found this update informative, go ahead and give this video a like. I would very, very much appreciate it. Also, join our Discord community where we post fairly regularly about anything new regarding patch 11.1 PTR. Let me know all your thoughts regarding these Mage changes in the comment section down below. And as always, I'll see all of you guys in the next one.